So, how does a war really start? And how does a last-ditch effort for peace fall apart? Today, we're taking you inside the rooms where it all happened. We're going to look at the secret pitch for regime change in Iran and then fast forward to the high-stakes peace talks that just collapsed. This is the story of Operation Epic Fury and what happens when diplomacy fails.
Let's just start right here. This is what the U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio reportedly said about Israel's grand plan for regime change just 2 weeks before the first bombs fell. In other words, it's bullshit. I mean, wow. That single word tells you everything about the deep skepticism at the very top, even as the drums of war were beating louder. It's a pretty stunning place to begin.
So, the big question is, how did we get from bullshit to a full-blown military operation in just a couple of weeks? Well, let's break down those critical meetings in February of 2026 that led directly to Operation Epic Fury.
Okay, just look at how fast this all moved. It's what's so wild about this whole thing. On February 11th, you have the Israeli Prime Minister giving this hard sell pitch. By February 28th, strikes are underway. We're talking about a proposal turning into a massive military attack in just 17 days. That is an incredibly fast timeline.
And what was this plan exactly? Well, it wasn't just about dropping a few bombs. No, this was the whole shebang, a 4-part strategy aimed at completely dismantling the Iranian government. We're talking killing the supreme leader, wiping out their missiles, sparking a revolution, and then, just installing a whole new leader. It was a plan for total, complete regime change.
And here's where you see that critical split in thinking, right? The American military and intelligence folks looked at this 4-part plan and basically broke it in two. The first 2 parts, the military stuff, they said, yeah, we can probably do that. But parts 3 and 4, the political goals, they called those detached from reality. That's where that bullshit comment really came from. A sense that, sure, we can win the battle, but there's no way we can win the peace that comes after.
And this division wasn't just among the intel analysts. Inside the White House, it was a full-on debate. On one side, you had the defense secretary, Pete Hegseth, who was the biggest cheerleader for war. But on the other, you had the vice president himself, J.D. Vance, who was forcefully arguing against it, warning President Trump it would be a disaster and a betrayal to his own voters. I mean, that's a direct warning from your own number 2.
But in the end, despite all the internal fighting and the stark warnings, President Trump went with his gut. With this direct order, sent from Air Force One with just 22 minutes to spare, the path to war was set in stone. Operation Epic Fury is approved. No aborts. Good luck. And with those words, it was on.
All right, so after weeks of fighting, the story shifts. Suddenly, there's this glimmer of hope. The world's focus moves from the battlefield to a very fragile attempt at peace, with a historic meeting set up in Islamabad, Pakistan, a high-stakes ceasefire negotiation. 21. For 21 straight hours, U.S. and Iranian officials were in the same room, face-to-face. This was the first direct high-level talk since the war began, and it was this intense marathon session to try and hammer out a deal. The whole world was holding its breath.
So who was actually in that room? On the American side, you had Vice President Vance, the same guy who'd argued against the war, and across the table, Iran's parliament speaker, a former commander in the Revolutionary Guard. So these weren't just some low-level diplomats. These were serious power players from 2 countries that absolutely despise each other, trying to find a way out of a war that nobody seemed to be winning.
Okay, so after 21 grueling hours, what went wrong? Why did it all just fall apart? Well, it came down to a few core disagreements, issues that neither side was willing to budge on. These were the sticking points that sent everybody right back to the battlefield.
And this slide really lays out the deadlock perfectly. You see, the U.S. was laser-focused on one thing: getting Iran to permanently swear off ever getting a nuclear weapon. That was it. But Iran showed up with its own list of non-negotiable red lines. They wanted money for damages, all their frozen assets back, and control over the Strait of Hormuz. It's like they were speaking 2 different languages. Their priorities were just worlds apart.
And really, this quote says it all for the American position. As Vice President Vance told the press right before he left Pakistan, that single issue, the nuclear one, was the core goal. Without that commitment from Iran, there was just no deal to be had, period. And just like that, the talks were over.
The failure of those talks created what you can only describe as a jarring split-screen moment for the world. It was this tale of 2 very different scenes that really highlighted the massive contrast between the gravity of the situation and how the administration was playing it publicly.
So on one side of the world, you have this:
the somber end to those marathon negotiations. Any path to peace seems to have collapsed. The American team leaves with nothing, with the weight of the world on their shoulders.
And then, literally at the same time, on the other side of the planet, this was the scene. You have President Trump and Secretary Rubio sitting ringside at a UFC fight in Miami, smiling, shaking hands, soaking in the cheers from the crowd. It was like they were a million miles away from the diplomatic crisis that had just imploded.
And you can bet people noticed this contrast. The political backlash was immediate and sharp. This message from the House Democrats' Foreign Affairs Committee called it amateur hour, a really stinging criticism about the administration's priorities at such a dangerous moment.
So, with the talks officially dead, the focus snapped right back to the military. The U.S. immediately announced its next moves. And let me tell you, they were a major escalation of the conflict. The war was about to get a whole lot worse.
This was the immediate consequence of that diplomatic failure. The U.S. decided to tighten the screws, moving from just airstrikes to a full-on naval blockade. The goal? To completely choke off Iran's entire sea trade and cripple their economy. This was a move designed to bring Iran to its knees.
And this next action is just as significant. The U.S. sent warships right through the Strait of Hormuz, that critical waterway that Iran had basically shut down. They started clearing mines. This was a direct military challenge to Iran's control over a choke point for about a fifth of the world's oil. It was a clear signal that the U.S. was not backing down.
Which brings us to the really urgent question we're all left with today. The attempt at peace failed, spectacularly. And in its place, both sides have just doubled down on military action. Right now, it looks like we're on a path of more and more conflict, not less. So with diplomacy off the table, what is the path to de-escalation? And what happens if they can't find one?